The conventional wisdom in church leadership assumes that a high weekly attendance signals a mature organization. But when we look closely at how congregations actually operate, a massive numerical size rarely translates to structural stability. Take a hypothetical congregation with thousands in attendance, but dependent entirely on a single dominant leader, with no pipeline for producing future elders. Compare that to a congregation of fewer than 100 people, deploying an 80% active membership to plant sister congregations. When the inevitable transition of leadership occurs, which of these organizations has the capacity to survive? This paradox between size and structure is built directly into the founding narrative of the church, beginning in the book of Acts with the congregation in Jerusalem. From its very first day, Jerusalem was massive. The text records about 3,000 converts being added and baptized to their ranks in a single day, in a matter of hours. Yet, despite those staggering numbers, the Jerusalem congregation had 0 installed elders or deacons. It relied entirely on the temporary, direct oversight of the apostles to function. By the standards of structural capacity, the largest congregation in the New Testament was completely dependent on single-source leadership, placing it at the earliest stage of organizational development. This distinction sits at the center of how Kairos intelligence defines congregational maturity. This exact framework tracks structural missional capacity, the practical ability to organize, equip, and continually deploy people effectively. A congregation's stage is determined by the depth of its internal leadership and the repeatability of its discipleship processes. Relying on headcounts to plan for the future masks systemic vulnerabilities. Measuring the specific operational depth of a congregation provides a clearer map for sustainable growth. We can map this capacity by tracking a congregation through 5 distinct operational stages. Stage 1 is the gathered congregation. This is a newly formed or recently reset group that relies heavily on a single founding leader to make decisions. Stage 2 is the established congregation. The church has installed leadership and stable systems, though it runs a risk of settling into institutional maintenance mode. Stage 3 is the equipped congregation, where members successfully transition from passive attenders to active ministers serving the body. Stage 4 is the multiplying congregation. The church now actively trains and releases its best leaders to start new works outward. Stage 5 is the sending congregation. It functions as a self-sustaining network hub, continually resourcing multiple external church plants. The progression follows a clear trajectory, establishing internal structure, deploying the membership, and reproducing networks. However, a congregation rarely matures at the exact same rate across all areas of its operation simultaneously. To see how a church is actually functioning, we have to look past the single timeline and break the organization down into 7 distinct operational domains. The internal structural domains track leadership and structure, member involvement, and worship and discipleship. The outward-facing domains measure evangelism, benevolence, financial stewardship, and multiplication. When assessing churches, the standard industry practice is to take these individual scores and average them together to assign a single overall stage grade. Kairos Intelligence issues a strict directive: never average these 7 domains into a single number. A mathematically average score flattens the data, actively obscuring the extreme highs and extreme lows in a congregation's operational profile. If you hide a failing structural domain behind a high overall average, you create severe organizational blind spots. Accurate diagnosis requires us to visualize the precise, uneven shape of the congregation's profile, rather than reducing complex systems to a single grade. By plotting these 7 domains individually, we expose the specific systemic imbalances holding a church back. Consider this chart, showing a profile we call outward-leaning, leadership-lagging. The danger here is acute. The church is committing to outward campaigns in evangelism and benevolence, but these efforts are outrunning the internal accountability needed to sustain them. The required remedy is to halt all new outreach initiatives. The congregation must focus entirely on installing formal eldership before adding external commitments. A very different profile emerges in the resourced but shallow congregation. This shape reveals a well-funded entity functionally run by a small core of paid staff, while the vast majority of the congregation remains entirely passive. To address this, the church must implement a spiritual gifts inventory and build a defined discipleship pipeline to get members involved. This reveals a bottleneck. A high-complexity digital campaign generates a volume of follow-up and pastoral care that requires significant internal infrastructure. If the internal structure remains at stage 1, the weight of the new initiative often causes the system to buckle. Consequently, Kairos calibrates outreach recommendations to match the lowest scoring domain in the profile. Recommending a multi-channel campaign to a church without a visitor follow-up system will fail because the organization cannot process the results. We also have to account for congregations operating in shrinking rural counties or constrained demographic environments. A maturity ceiling means a church has failed to build the internal leadership and structures necessary to grow. A context ceiling represents external demographic limits, such as a shrinking county population, that cap potential numerical growth. Judging a church in a declining county by the attendance metrics of a booming suburban congregation is analytically flawed. Under a strict context ceiling, we have to redefine what stage 5 sending maturity actually looks like. Success here means prioritizing regional resource sharing with neighboring churches, utilizing digital extensions for teaching, and implementing robust eldership succession planning. Maximizing these internal domains against a hard demographic constraint is a complete and effective expression of congregational capacity. By replacing subjective guesswork with an objective structural map, the Kairos maturity model allows any congregation to identify the exact structural requirement to expand its work.